Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Carbondale NAACP Community Conversation Project 2025, Know Before You Vote. We have a wonderful, informative session planned for you this evening featuring speaker Dr. John Jackson, who has had a very distinguished career at Southern Illinois University, including roles as Chancellor, Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, and Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and currently on staff at the Southern Illinois University Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. We ask that if you have any questions for Dr. Jackson, you will put them in the chat. We will also be monitoring on Facebook, and we will get to as many of your questions as possible. So, without further ado, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm always glad, excuse me, I'm glad to be joining the NAACP and for Dr. Flowers extending that invitation. As many of you know, we have done a series like this before for other elections, and it's a good series. I think it's important for people to know these things about the upcoming election. And I appreciate Jennifer Robinson and the Carbondale Library for handling the logistics in the Zoom tonight. My title is, What is Project 2025 and why should I be interested in this? You'll find that some people have at least heard about Project 25, some only vaguely, but don't have much of details. For most voters, though, it's not really something that's very much on their agenda. And I think it's important, and I think it's good that the library and the NAACP are trying to get the word out about something as important as this. My brief answer to the question of why should we be interested in it is that this is a massive effort by former Trump administration officials and other political activists very much on the conservative side to get ready for Donald Trump to be elected president on November the 5th, and then to take over the reins of the government on January the 20th of next year. A little quick history you may not know now, but former President Trump was not at all prepared to win in 2016. It took them a very long time to get organized bureaucratically and get up to speed in those early days because most of them just hadn't really believed that he was going to win the election. So they were not able to use maximum influence and power afforded to them as head of the executive branch of government. And it took them really months and even the first year or so to get that under control. This time they plan to hit the ground running, as the phrase goes, and they want to make a maximum impact as quickly as they can and make as many public policy changes as they can and make them very, very quickly. This plan is formally run by the Heritage Foundation in Washington. The Heritage Foundation, as some of you will recognize, is a very conservative think tank type operation. It is widely known and respected in Washington, and it is especially interested in the executive branch and how it functions. I think you should look at this as the Heritage Foundation being a sort of shadow government, as we would call it in parliamentary terms. They are now not in power, and they want to get ready for the next administration. And of course, they expected to be in power. It is clearly a master plan for the second Trump administration. It's a very detailed setting out of their objectives and their priorities and the policies they want to change, much of which dates back to the Lyndon Johnson Great Society administration, and some of it dating back to Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And it certainly targets most immediately the Obama administration obviously the Biden administration, and even going back to much of the Clinton years. My best analogy here that people would be familiar is that this is kind of the Republican platform for this year. In 2020, that was the time of COVID, of course, the Republicans didn't even adopt an official platform. They simply said, whatever President Trump's been doing, that's what we want to do, and that's what we want to keep doing. And so it was unprecedented for a major candidate and campaign not to have an official platform. It turned out didn't matter a whole lot because they were going to keep at the Trump agenda at that point. You may not know, but they did have a formal platform adopted in the convention, but it was only 16 pages long, and it was also very Spartan, and much of it was an attack on the Biden administration. So into that void stepped the Heritage Foundation. Now, a bit of a disclaimer here. The thing is more than 900 pages long of fine type. So I have to admit, I haven't read all 900 plus pages. I've used a lot of secondary source material, but it is all directly quoted. And I'm going to quote from that particular document that is the original, but it is coming partially from secondary sources. I'm going to rely especially on a document called Media Matters for America, and it is kind of a guide to what the whole Project 2025 is all about, and it is really quite handy. Even for that synopsis, it took them 5 experts and 5 authorities to summarize that 900-page document. By the way, the document itself is entitled Mandate for Leadership, a Conservative Promise. The authors say that Project 2025, quote, focuses on packing the next Republican administration with loyalists to former President Donald Trump, and it describes these Project 2025 priorities and in detail how they can be implemented and getting a conservative administration in place and functioning really before day one. It also includes a lot of personnel training and a 180-page playbook recommending what they do specifically. I quote again, these proposals would severely inhibit the federal government's protections, for example, around reproductive rights, LGBTQ, civil rights, immigration, and climate change. That's just a small sampling of the large number, and I can't do justice to all the different topics tonight. This organization, the Heritage Foundation, however, is backed by and supplemented by over 100 different conservative organizations and individuals that have been involved in writing it. And it's also mostly funded not only by Heritage Foundation funding, but also with funding from the Koch brothers. Now, let me go through and talk about specific policy topics. The first one of these is entitled Personnel and Staffing. Again, a quote, one of the key elements of Project 25's administrative goals is to reinstate the executive order known as Schedule F from the former Trump years. This would reclassify thousands of federal employees and make them, quote, at-will workers and give the administration the ability to fire employees who don't agree to and follow the Trump administration's suggestions and directives. It creates a training academy which teach them how to then get these things done. And it gives them knowledge and expertise in the government immediately beginning to roll back a number of policies that are in place and replacing them with conservative ideas as they apply to the federal government. For example, it makes it clear that the Department of Justice is not an independent agency as it has traditionally been. It says this agency should become, in effect, the lawyer for President Trump. He railed against the Department of Justice many times, even in his own administration, because sometimes, you may remember, at that point, Attorney General Bill Barr would not always go along with him, particularly near the end. And Trump believes he learned a lesson from that. So he's going to get control of not only the Department of Justice, but most notably the FBI. The next one is entitled Reproductive Rights. Quote, Project 2025 suggests the next conservative administration should strike any mention of abortion from government laws, policies, and regulations. It suggests the next conservative administration should reinstate the Comstock Act in order to ban and track and limit anything to do with mail order abortions. As we know, that has been a very controversial item right there. It suggests restoring Trump-era religious and moral exemptions to any use of contraceptives that are provided for under the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, and it would allow any employers to deny coverage for that particular medical procedure. The Department of Justice and federal law enforcement, again, would come under fire. My synopsis is that they plan to get the FBI director under control as they see it. Former President Trump has already specifically indicated that he's going to fire the current director of the FBI. They're supposed to have a 10-year term, but if he goes after the director of the FBI, he can probably get that done, especially if he controls the attorney general. Under climate change and the environment, it says, quote, Project 2025 would eliminate environmental protections and further delay climate action. The Department of Energy chapter in the book calls for, quote, eliminating 3 agency offices that are essential for the energy transition and reducing funding to agencies that are related to any kind of renewable energy. They have an entire chapter dedicated to the Environmental Protection Agency that calls for shrinking the EPA by significant numbers of employees and firing all the new hires that the Biden administration has added. It also recommends opening the Arctic for oil drilling and expanding general projects generally, and leasing land in Western states for oil and coal. We all know that immigration has been a major source of conflict. This is going to be a major target as well. Basically, they're going to start by dismantling the protection for the dreamers, the so-called dreamers. They're going to get rid of the DREAM Act, which was really an executive act by the Obama administration originally. The policy book also suggests restricting T visas, which are temporary visas that are used for those that are victims of human trafficking and those who are victims of crimes that occur inside the United States. The next Republican administration would also strip hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of individuals who have been in the U.S. already for decades and take away their legal protections, which are under something called the temporary protected status. Trump and his followers have been quite open about it. If you've watched any of the Missouri television on KFVS Channel 12, for example, coming out of our sister state next door in their Republican primary. All you got was the promise that they were going to build the wall and that they were going to get rid of and deport all of the illegals, as they termed them. So the dreamers, plus a lot of other people, are at least going to be subject to the possibilities of being exported. How the countries that are supposed to receive them are going to react, many of them never having in any time living in those countries, is not at all clear. And how to get the wall built, for that matter, turns out to be a lot harder than it was touted to be. But that's a hot button issue. All of us have an interest in education, so, quote, the first sentence of the project's chapter on the Department of Education simply states, quote, federal education policy should be limited and ultimately the federal Department of Education should be entirely eliminated. Their view is that every parent should have the option of directing his or her child's share of education funding, which is generated mostly by the state and local taxpayers. It would empower the president or the parents to choose a set of educational options and to choose which school they're going to go to. Those of you who've had experience in our public education know that that would be a very tall order, not at all clear how they might take care of getting all that done logistically. One of the big targets is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the so-called critical race theory. It argues against every factor of either one of those plans and programs. Under DEI, it says, quote, in the foreword to the mandate for leadership, the Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts calls for the entire deletion of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation of any kind, and any piece of legislation that exists. By the way, you may think that sounds like a tall order, but many of you know I originated in Arkansas and I keep up with their politics. And Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders has exactly done that in the state of Arkansas, my native land, already. It also calls for investigating and prosecuting discrimination under the guise of the so-called DEI, or diversity, education, and inclusion, or equity and inclusion. In other words, if you've been doing it and have been mandating others to do it, you might well be in legal trouble. Going back to LBJ, it argues that the Higher Education Act of 1965 under Lyndon Johnson should be amended so that Title IV, which allows them the gatekeeper role that mandates educational institutions to do DEI type policies, would be rescinded. On national defense, I'll give you a quick thumbnail. My summary is they think the military is now, quote, woke, and they're going to get rid of anything that looks like woke. They're going to cut out all of the military training and recruitment that would weaken the ability to fight as they see it, and thus no emphasis shall be placed on DEI kinds of objectives. So they've got a lot of other stuff, as you might imagine, on the Department of Defense, but that whole question of how you train the troops and what troops you try to get into the military in the first place would be significantly altered from what it is now. I could go on because there's so much there in 900 pages. You've got a flavor for the basics already, I trust. I would give you a quick summary, which is that this is first and foremost very much a culture wars document, but it is a culture wars document plus a great deal more. The overarching theme is to empower the executive branch and empower the president to control the executive branch. When you stop and connect that to what the Supreme Court's already been doing, particularly the court's recent ruling with regard to the president's power and the whole question of presidential immunity, we've already had the Supreme Court create a much more powerful presidency than we have had, because he put basically a great deal of store on giving protection to the president when he is performing, quote, official duties. And a great deal of what we previously thought were unofficial things that he might be doing, for example, the argument over taking all of that classified down to Mar-a-Lago with him, all of that would be deemed official and thus all right. Basically, the Chief Justice Roberts decision in Trump versus the U.S. empowers the president under the idea of official duties to an extent never seen before. Some people that are critics have said the old adage that nobody is above the law would now be an asterisk beside it, which would say that, well, the president is above the law. Some of you go way back and will remember Richard Nixon getting into trouble and then later resigning the presidency under pressure. And not terribly long after that, he had the British journalist who was at that time fairly famous, David Frost. And in that interview, he got off a memorable phrase that if the president does it, it's not illegal. That was Richard Nixon then. This would be Donald Trump on steroids compared to Richard Nixon. As you can hear, it already plans to weaken the civil service rules and basically undermine the Pendleton Act, which goes back to the 1880s. It's been in place ever since, protecting the career civil servants, basically. The Republicans, in some form or another, have been wanting to get rid of the Department of Education for a great long time. They've wanted to get rid of the Department of Energy and the Department of Commerce at varying times. They've certainly gone after critical race theory, the Dreamers, and so forth, things that we've touched on. So I'll leave that part with that. I want to go quickly to the role of J.D. Vance, because it turns out he is an important player in this whole drama. Trump has tried even actually to disassociate himself to some extent, because he claims he doesn't know anything about it and it's not his people. But in appointing J.D. Vance, it becomes very much his people, because J.D. Vance has been very close to this project. He is very close with this Kevin Roberts, who is the head of the foundation and really the source of Project 2025. Turns out that Vance has written the intro to Roberts' new book, and he makes it plain that he's long been a fan of Roberts and the Heritage Foundation. And not surprising, since Vance is something of a public intellectual, and it's the kind of things that he would be interested in and taking part in. Now, recently they made something of a show of the person who was in charge, not of the whole project and Heritage Foundation itself, but just in writing and correlating the project. He basically left that position and left the Heritage Foundation, but this Roberts guy stays in place. The Roberts guy has said, including other things, that the Ivy League colleges and universities, by the way, Yale and Harvard, Yale where Vance went to law school, are all controlled by the left. The FBI is controlled by the left. The New York Times is controlled by the left and other major media outlets. The National Institute of Infectious Diseases Why that? Well, if you think back just a little bit to 2020, that's Dr. Fauci's operation. They want to get that under control and make sure there's no more Dr. Fauci's out there with some independence of his own. They even don't like the Boy Scouts. Well, now, of course, the Boy Scouts have merged with the Girl Scouts, so maybe that's one way they look at the Boy Scouts as being a left-wing organization. In his book, Roberts has said, quote, conservatives need to burn down these institutions if we're going to preserve the American way of life. He says there's going to be a second American revolution. And he says, quote, we are in the process of this second American revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be. He has advocated, for example, the outlawing of the abortion completely by using the Comstock Act, as I noted earlier, stopping the mailing of abortion pills to states where it's legal, and not letting women travel to other states as just examples of this. Okay, so what about public opinion? What is the story on public opinion, and exactly how popular is that? Well, it turns out if you do what we're doing tonight, when you get people specifically to focus on the specifics that we've already been discussing, a lot of them, even significant majorities of them, don't really like these proposals when they hear about them. They think a great number of these things are as they should be and are not at all in favor of getting rid of a great number of them. Obviously, the question of abortion has been very much in that area where we've been having that debate, and it continues. And that has been an example of the ways in which this does go against public opinion. And finally, I want to save some time for Q&A, but I want to wrap up very quickly by asking, what are the possibilities that the second Trump administration can get all this stuff done? It is, to be sure, a very ambitious schedule for things to do and for the scope of things that they want to cover. That requires changing the laws would be more difficult than changing the executive branch rules and regulations and any executive orders, which they can change the next day after inauguration. But getting these things through Congress depends on a lot. And if you think about it a minute, you know very quickly it depends on whether or not we have a unified versus a divided government, as political scientists call it. That is, will it be a unified government under President Trump again? If Trump is elected, that is a very high possibility, even probability, because you know right now the margin in the Senate is very, very narrow, one vote to be specific. The House is very closely divided with the Republicans in charge, and the margin there is 222 to 212. So it's not much of a margin there. There's a lot of consternation among Democrats about the possibility of losing the Senate because that margin is so narrow. The Democrats are actually more positive about their chances of taking over the House, I think, than they are about retaining the majority in the Senate. But be that as it may, if the Democrats were to lose the presidency and retain one of the two bodies, most notably if they retain the Senate, then they would have a lot to say about just how far the Trump administration could go. But if it's a unified government with Trump and the Republican Party in charge of the Congress, they already have the U.S. Supreme Court. So in that case, obviously, the chances of getting a great number of these things done are much improved. So, with that political assessment tacked on to the end, let me stop, take a breath, and let's see if we can get some people that want to talk about some of these things, okay? Dr. Flowers?
Okay, I'm looking, and so far I don't see any questions in the chat, people.
I'll bet you've got something you've been wanting to talk about. So let's start with you.
Oh, you don't want to start with me. Listen, when the guy that says that this will happen and without bloodshed if the left let it be so, what would you say would be the probability of another civil war?
Well, I don't think the probability of another civil war in the way we think about it is very realistic because when you look at it now, we are deeply divided in many ways, like we were deeply divided at the time of the Civil War. But that division was concentrated and was geographic, and thus the South, the states of the South were all contiguous. They had a definable border, and it went all the way up to Richmond and practically over into Washington, D.C., and almost into Maryland, for example. But nevertheless, that's the way you have traditional civil wars. But what we do have is a lot of places where people who are prone to violence, like, for example, these militia groups that in rural areas are popular in particularly places like upstate Michigan, for example, and certain parts of Missouri, for example, those people can be prone to violence. And their sense of conspiracy, their sense of complaint, their sense of being put upon is very strong, and some of them go very far. For example, there was that group that planned to kidnap uh, Governor Winmer of Michigan, and it went really very far in that planning process. So that's not a civil war, but it nevertheless is a sort of an encouragement of violence to really settle our political issues. And of course, classically, we think that we're supposed to settle those differences at the ballot box and in peaceful elections and in the peaceful transfer of power.
So, do you think adding on to the Supreme Court is an answer for the way the court seems to be going at this point?
Adding on is certainly one possibility that would do it. Uh, President Biden's plan would be to have an age limit, and that would then create a rotating Supreme Court that would change every 18 years because that would be the term, and thus it's not quite packing the court under the traditional Franklin Roosevelt idea. It's just giving the possibility of a president, of even one-term presidents, being able to uh, appoint ideally two, is the way the math works. And thus that would, over some time, although it would take at least a decade and at least one or two presidencies to finally change the composition of the court. But right now, at this 6-3 margin we have, there's not a whole lot of change that's going to happen to the Supreme Court anytime soon.
Here are a couple of questions.
Okay.
Not directly Project 2025, but will you comment on the concern that local officials may refuse to certify the election, thus making it impossible for states to certify?
Well, that is a popular cause, and indeed it became really very relevant and somewhat rampant in 2020, as we all know. Um, the problem with that is local government officials, starting with the mayor and the city council, but also including those who work the polls and those who have to certify the results. In Illinois, it's the county clerks, of course. They take an oath to uphold the Constitution and uphold the laws of the land. So that question I raised earlier about the president goes all the way down to the courthouse in this question, because you can't pick and choose those laws that you're going to follow if you're a public official. It's like the sheriffs that say they're not going to enforce certain laws. For example, the whole question of cash bonding in this state has led a number of sheriffs to say they're just not going to enforce the law. Well, you're not supposed to get that option. And while it is not directly in the Project 2025, it is directly relevant to some of their advocacy, but it's certainly an idea that will be reinforced and tested in this next outcome. Because the next test, if former President Trump were to lose, would be, what does he do next, and what do the MAGA supporters do next? Do we get back to a January the 6th type mentality? Would they be emboldened to try to do that again? I think all of that is a real possibility if Trump does not win. So it may not all be over on November the 5th. I don't want to sound too Pollyannish here.
Yeah. So where can we find this info for a format for young voters who either feel disenfranchised or determined to vote third party?
Boy, that's a tough one, because young voters so heavily depend on social media. There need to be social media sources, for example, explaining to them in very basic terms why voting for a third party is not a smart and wise thing for them to do. Young people tend to be more prone to that than any other age category. They don't have a record and a history of their own. They're not attached to a political party the way older people are in many cases. I've talked to some SIU students this round saying that they were disgusted with both candidates. That was before the change on the Democratic side, and saying they were going to either vote for Robert Kennedy or not vote, or vote for one of the other splinter candidates. That may make you feel good, but it's a waste of your vote, is basically the answer. But there should be better civic training in our schools, and I'm partially implicated here because I taught an Intro to American Government course to thousands of SIU students over the years, and I'm afraid I didn't always do the best job on some of these things if you judge by what young people think and don't understand. So anyway, it's a challenge.
Okay, going back to the previous question, how long would the wait be if Georgia and maybe others fail to certify the election? What is the law to have this done by January 20th?
Well, the law is very specific. It's approximately December the 18th that the vote in the Congress to accept the product of the states has to be taken. That basically is what was going on then on January the 6th, when they have to certify that, but they have to get that all together by third week in December, I believe it is. So we've got to get that done and then get it certified by January the 6th. If that translates, it will be January 7th, probably this time. But at any rate, we've got to get that done, get it to Washington and get it counted, and no playing of games. It has to come from the right authority in the states, which is what the fight was over in 2020.
So, Dr. Jackson, can you talk more about what college age students would lose under Project 2025?
Well, they've made it plain there won't be any more deferring of college loans. And they are also not going to be subjected to people trying to tell them about diversity, equality, and inclusiveness, and having universities that have plans for that. And the whole issue of higher education is really now quite controversial and politicized in ways that it used to not be. Uh, the whole question of what should you be teaching in the classrooms gets back, for example, to critical race theory. I was talking to some people who teach in Florida just about a week and a half ago, and they are under the gun because of DeSantis rules about things that they can say and not say in their classrooms in the universities. And they said that higher education people are leaving Florida because some of them object so strongly to the kind of strictures that professors are being subjected to in the state of Florida. So that whole question of control of the classroom doesn't just begin and end in elementary school. It goes all the way up through higher education.
And here's another question. Can the Dems do anything in their campaigns to educate young voters about Project 2025, i.e. TikTok?
Well, that's a possibility. Um, I think I think the vice president has already spoken out about it in some of her campaigning too, and that shines the light on it. And Governor Walz, certainly he's talked about it from time to time, so that's a pretty high level kind of soapbox. Uh, I'm not enough of an expert on how do you get content into things that are social media like TikTok, which of course is under its own pressure from the feds right now. But certainly it's not the Southern Illinoisan that's giving us and giving young people the word about what's going on. It's something out there on their phones. And I think the Democrats certainly know that at the Harris campaign level. And I think they are savvy enough that they're probably taking some steps to address that. One other thing I haven't mentioned, but I'll add here because it's relevant, they are really doing a lot on the so-called ground war. They're doing a lot to have a small army of people out knocking on doors and trying to educate people face to face. And when you get right down to it, that is the best way to educate prospective voters, young people included. And they have got well over 100,000 people employed on staff doing nothing but that. The Republicans are taking a different tact, and they are farming that out to a number of interest groups and a number of nonprofits that want to do that for them. And it's not clear yet just how effective that will be, because here's a place where the Trump campaign does not have the kind of control that the Harris campaign has. And just off the top, I would say that the Harris campaign should have an advantage on that.
Okay, I will do a plug here for the NAACP is also soliciting volunteers and believe that the neighbor to neighbor education is better than having other people who aren't familiar with people in the neighborhood come and talk to them.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Next question. What is a recommended source for a good summary of Project 2025? Few persons would engage in reading 900 pages, but it is important for the content to get in the hands of voters who are genuinely troubled by the frightful content.
Yeah, one thing is this, it's called Media Matters for America. And it's an article by Lawton Hollins and 3 or 4 other names. And it is a good synoptic account. It's only 25 pages long. And you can Google that. It was published on July the 1st. It's still very relevant and still very recent. Politico has also written about this in some detail, and you can Google Politico and find some references there as well.
Next question. Would you consider Agenda 47 the Cliff Notes of Project 2025? And is that a valuable tool to educate voters? And how do you keep that nonpartisan when it seems clear that Project 2025 is the GOP plan?
Yeah, I think that is. It's a shorter version, as I understand it, and it would be a good source to look at too. I've not checked it out myself, but I know about it. So basically, what I know about it is it's a good idea and would be a short version.
Okay, although it does leave out some of the more
Yeah,
controversial issues.
right.
It's Project 2025 with sugar on top.
Okay. I hadn't heard it that
Okay.
way.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, here we go. The Carbondale Public Library has a YouTube video link in the chat if you want to look at it. I know on YouTube there are lots of Project 2025 YouTubes. Not sure how accurate they all are, but since the library is suggesting this one, I'm sure our librarian, Jennifer Robertson, has checked it out.
Oh, it's
Right.
actually just a link to our page, but they can share this very program that you are having right now with others.
Okay.
So I'm sure it's very accurate.
Okay, so with this link, you can go to the Carbondale Library. Can you go to the Facebook page or the YouTube?
That's just the link to the YouTube page.
Okay. Okay, Dr. Jackson, next question. What type of ideology and mindset do you think drives Project 2025?
Well, it's a very conservative, even extremist view. It's what the old Republican Party down through Eisenhower, through Reagan, for example, is really not where MAGA is. They are now much further to the right, and thus it is, I think, being driven by people who used to be called extremists. They are fearful. They have conspiracy theory mentality. They are resentful. Particularly, there's a strong strand of resentment in the rural areas against the urban areas, and that comes out again and again. And it's just an acceptance of levels of discourse and even ways of treating the opponent and how you talk about the opponent that used to not be a part of our national norms, our expectations about how people are supposed to behave in the political realm. The whole idea of sort of being civil to the opponent has really gotten to be fairly passe and sadly out of date now.
So, Dr. Jackson, do you think race has any role in this? I know for a long time in the country, we've been saying that by whatever year the minority is going to become the majority. Is that a plan for when that happens?
Well, that fear is certainly stimulating a big part of it. That's the whole fear of immigration, because the idea of the so-called replacement theory that people of color are going to replace white people as the majority drives a good deal of that fear. I also, on the reference of race, refer you to the interview that the Black journalist had in Chicago with former President Trump when he started out on the very first question, uh, sparring with the ABC News host and going after her. And the way he went after her uh, certainly looked like there was a certain amount of resentment and racism involved in that. And the way he went on to raise the question of when did Kamala Harris become Black was just an area that is so ridiculous. We wouldn't have gone anywhere close to that. Anybody that knows anything knows that she went to Howard University. She joined the oldest sorority for Black women in the country. And that was when she was an undergraduate at Howard. So it was a ridiculous position to take. And I don't see how you can say that it wasn't somehow or another related to race. And then the whole issue of her originally being identifying with South Asian rather than Black got all convoluted in that. You got the issue of people of color from Southeast Asia, most notably in this case India, is wrapped up in that whole sorry kind of discussion.
So since the vice president certifies the election votes from the state, since the vice president is candidate Harris, would she still serve in that role to certify the election?
You know, that is a very good point, and I hadn't thought about it, but the answer is yes. She would serve the same role that Vice President Pence did at the time. But if you will remember, that is what's called a ministerial role. It does not have any discretion in it in the Constitution. Vice President Pence refused Donald Trump's order to not certify, and he went ahead and certified it. And his break with Trump has now been totally irreconcilable. You will note he has said specifically he will not vote for Donald Trump. So that summarizes the role. It's simply have the clerk announce the roll call and then certified as vice president as it was provided by the roll call, as was provided by the states. That's the way it goes, and that's the way it ultimately went, although by the skin of its teeth in the 2020 election.
Okay, someone would like for you to repeat the author's name again.
Lawton, Lawton, Hollins, Hollins, et al., because there are a number of others involved there. But it's under Media Matters for America. If you Google it, it'll come up for you.
Okay, another question, maybe the last. What would you say is the profile for a Trump follower?
Well, it's pretty well known and well researched profile, and it's been in place since the election of 2016, and its shorthand is the MAGA, MAGA Republicans. They tend to be less well educated. They tend to live predominantly in rural, small towns and small cities. They tend to be often blue collar workers. They have often been people that are not associated with unions, although unions are a target for Trump this time. They are, for whatever reason, as we were mentioning, disenchanted and resentful of their plight, and thus they tend to follow these populist kinds of movements now through 3 straight elections for Donald Trump. And I'll add a PS to that. Elon Musk is going to interview Trump on X, and he's also a type that is well on board in many, many cases. That is the billionaire class. Certainly not all billionaires, though.
What about the Black people we see at a Trump rally?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know enough about. I always see them, but I don't know any research that really gets at that. Traditional values, traditional religious outlooks on things like abortions, for example, those come to mind, but I'm not aware of any very specific research and data.
And what do you think happened to the GOP of old? Why would they support Trump?
Well, they weren't prepared for Donald Trump to win in 16, and they thought they had 17 candidates total. They thought any one of the more mainstream, starting, if you will remember, with Jeb Bush, but every one of them wilted in front of Donald Trump's attacks, and they just weren't prepared for that, and he fairly quickly took over the party.
Do you think Democrats are doing as little as the Republicans for Palestine? Can anything more be done by the Democratic Party?
Well, that's going to be an interesting thing playing out starting a week from tonight. It's going to be very difficult for Vice President Harris to thread that needle. She's already shown that she wants to back the president, as she should, and back Israel in traditional ways, but add a very strong condemnation of some of Israel's policies with respect to not protecting human life. And she's opened enough daylight that you can already see that. So it's up to her right now to speak for the Democrats, and you can be both at the same time. You can acknowledge Israel's right to exist without endorsing all of the things that they've done up to and including the bombardment of that school just 2 days ago. So that's got to be the position that she takes.
Okay, I think we are done with questions in the Q&A as well as the chat. So Dr. Jackson, let me thank you for gathering this information and presenting it to us. Thank you to Jennifer Robertson and the Carbondale Public Library. And for those of you who've heard the information, don't keep it to yourself.
Thank you. I
Let's be
appreciate
sure.
the invitation.
Yes, okay. Good night, everyone.
Good night.